If you've been anywhere near the Pokemon community in the last 4 years, you've probably noticed that it's been rife with arguments about the quality of the games, where the series fell off, and which games are underrated. I replayed almost every main series Pokemon generation while making this video to see the ups and downs of each generation for myself. This video will explore what new features each game brought to the table and how that affected the series moving forward. Chapter 1: Antique Pokemon. The game development company Game Freak got its start in 1983, selling video game magazines. They eventually started creating video games themselves, and after 6 years of creating obscure games that you likely have never heard of, they created Pokemon Red, Blue, and Green in 1996. These games were massively successful, as I'm sure you already know, selling a combined 45 million sales across Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow. To be frank, I'm not a fan of the oldest Pokemon games because I think that the later entries just make them entirely obsolete. However, what I would like to focus on within the scope of these games is how good Game Freak got the formula the first time. The way that Pokemon stats work in the first entry of the series is incredibly similar to how they work in every following game, with the only major change being the splitting of a Pokemon's special stat into two separate stats for attacking and defending. Mountains of new moves, mechanics, and monsters would be added to the franchise in the following generations, but Gen 1 did introduce a huge number of things as a starting point. And if I were to praise Generation 1 for any of its own merits, it would be for its world design. The world in the Generation 1 games is not quite like anything we've seen since, with allusions to things that would never happen in modern games, such as the Pokemon War that Surge mentions, and references to real-world events and media, such as the Amazon, India, and the movie Stand By Me. The plot is also much smaller in scope, which I think is actually to its benefit, lacking any mention of legendary Pokemon, nor larger-than-life schemes from the evil organization. The game instead focuses on telling a simple story and executing it well. The best example of this is your rival Blue. He's an extremely simple character, and he very effectively serves a specific role, and despite his apparent two-dimensional character, he's many people's favorite rival. All that being said, the actual game is lacking polish to the nth degree. The sprites for creatures in Red, Blue, and Green can sometimes look pretty unappealing, and there are no in-game descriptions of a move's power, accuracy, or effect, and there are so many glitches in the game that there are hours and hours of YouTube videos documenting them. The progression is honestly pretty bad, and a huge number of monsters are just not worth using because they never learn any good moves. But despite that, the core mechanics of types, physical, special, and status moves, as well as a huge number of fantastic collectible monsters, gave the series a surprisingly strong introduction. Unfortunately, some of the design decisions made in Gen 1 would be vestigially carried into future games to their detriment. Trading being necessary to evolve many Pokemon species has become a major annoyance, and the prohibitively high cost of vitamins like protein, zinc, and the other make crafting a competitive team in-game much more time-consuming in the future games. HMs would also persist a long time after this generation, despite being one of the worst aspects of the entire series. After Generation 1, games would continue building off what came before them, starting with Generation 2, Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Some fundamental additions to the game were added in this generation, such as splitting the aforementioned special stat into special attack and special defense, as well as the introduction of hold items, breeding Pokemon, shedding Pokemon, the battle tower, the in-game clock, higher quality sprites, and even animated sprites in battle, although this was only present in Crystal version, and only for your opponent's Pokemon. Up to Generation 5, every new generation made brand new sprites for every Pokemon, but in the case of Generation 2, Gold and Silver had unique Pokemon sprites for each Pokemon from one another. In Gens 3 and 4, the remakes of Red, Blue, Yellow, and Gold, Silver, Crystal would also create unique Pokemon sprites, in addition to the new renditions created for Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, and Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, giving each game a wonderful dollop of individuality. The increase in quality present in the sprite work could also be seen in other aspects of GSC, such as balancing the type chart by adding Steel and Dark-type Pokemon, adding clock-based events such as the bug-catching contest, and just a lot of new Pokemon and moves in addition to the previously existing ones. In addition to everything that was new, all of the legacy Pokemon and moves could be accessed by trading them from previous games. Any of the 151 original Pokemon could even be sent backwards from a Gen 2 game to Gen 1, which is especially impressive and has never been a feature in any game since. The fan-favorite post-game story in Gen 2 also allowed the player to return to Kanto, and explore an admittedly simplified adaptation of the region. Despite what it brought to the table, Pokemon Generation 2 was still far from perfect. Possessing bizarre design decisions such as not giving almost any Johto gym leader new Pokemon native to Johto, a very awkwardly paced level curve, and making very large percentage of the new Pokemon so weak or inaccessible that they're practically unusable. Because the console 3D Pokemon battle simulators are very often brought up in discussion by fans, I thought it was appropriate to include them in this video. Now, before writing this script, I had never actually played Pokemon Stadium. I was actually quite looking forward to it despite the fact that it would be missing now series staples like items and abilities. Unfortunately, I must report that Pokemon Stadium, like Red, Blue, and Yellow, is made obsolete by later entries in the series. Because it's a game all about battling, it actually made Generation 1's shortcomings in its battle system much more apparent. Without items and abilities, niches for less immediately useful Pokemon like Raticate just don't exist. Pokemon are usually lacking 4 useful moves to add to their moveset, and battling against Psychic-type opponents just felt unfair in this game. The speed of each battle is also agonizingly slow, which becomes very apparent while attempting the Gym Leader Castle. But people don't bring up this game to talk about its balance, they bring it up to talk about the animations that the Pokemon in the game have. And yeah, there are some really cool animations in the game that convey a lot of personality, which is just not present in the mainline releases. Things like Gloom opening its eyes wide from being hit and Jinx's body imploding when it faints are amazing animations that far surpass the standard for animations in the main series. I'm sure that this game was much more appealing when it released, because it was the first time you could battle with your Pokemon on the TV, let alone in 3D. And obviously the later Pokemon battle sims like Battle Revolution didn't exist yet. But because we now live in a world where PBR and Pokemon XD exist, and the modern Pokemon games are already 3D and playable on your TV, I really can't find a reason to play this game in the modern day. Pokemon Stadium 2 is, for the most part, just more Pokemon Stadium set in Generation 2. You can battle the gym leaders from Kanto and Johto, battles still take way too long, the models have animations that are much more expressive than the new 3D games, basically just more of the same. However, the addition that I was honestly shocked by was the Trainer Academy in the game. This isn't your Paldean Academy. The information in the Academy is vast and essential. Almost anything you could want to know is here, and you can see the full type chart, explanations on stab and status effects, a list of how and when every Pokemon evolves, a list of all moves with actual transparency about what they do and how likely secondary effects are, and I was most shocked by a list of the Pokemon egg groups, and what Pokemon belong to which group. In all my time playing each main series Pokemon game, I've come to expect that compendiums such as this would never exist in any Pokemon game, let alone with such detail and ease of use. My suspicion is that the reason why the games are so unprecedentedly transparent with the player about how its mechanics work is due to the fact that Game Freak did not develop it. This game was developed by HAL Laboratories, and they did such a good job presenting all this critical information to the player in a way that was easy to parse and not intimidating. Although, it does make me a bit mad that, as you'll see in future installments, this kind of player resource never returns. The first 2 generations of Pokemon took major strides in developing the Pokemon experience. Generation 1 defined the fundamentals of the battling system, and Gen 2 refined the experience that the first game pioneered, by rounding out the selection of moves, introducing hold items and breeding, balancing the type chart, and obviously by adding new creatures to its own original setting. On top of all that, it seemed like transparency between the game and the player about the mechanics of battling was increasing, with moves gaining viewable descriptions, and the Trainer Academy in Pokemon Stadium 2 divulging to the player almost anything they could want to know about how battling works. I personally don't care much for either of the first 2 generations, but it is undeniable that they were both critical to the accumulation for the eventual peak of the series. Intermission 1, Replayability. One of the best parts of the Pokemon games is how replayable they can be. The opposing trainers that you encounter in the campaign will be identical across playthroughs, from the Pokemon they use to their moves, EVs, and IVs. But what changes between your playthroughs is the Pokemon in your party that you will use to overcome obstacles. The best example of this is the first gym leader of the Generation 1 games, Brock. Brock is a Rock-type gym leader who has a Geodude and Onix, both of which are Rock and Ground type. This typing makes them extremely resilient against essentially every Pokemon the player has access to from tall grass at this point in the game. Flying, Normal, and Poison attacks are all resisted by Brock's 2 Pokemon, and unless you're playing Yellow version, Mankey will not be available yet, and Nidoran won't even learn the fighting move Double Kick until level 43. But that's no problem, you can just use your starter Bulbasaur or Squirtle to use Brock's typing against him, and hit him with a 4 times effective Vine Whip or Water Gun. But if you chose Charmander as your starter Pokemon, get ready to Skull Bash your head against a brick wall. Like all the other Pokemon you have access to at this point, Charmander's moves are all resisted by Brock's Pokemon, making Brock's gym fight incredibly tilted against Charmander players. This will obviously create a huge rift between the experiences that Bulbasaur and Squirtle players will have compared to the Charmander players. And this is just the first gym badge with a very limited number of Pokemon available to the player at this point. By the end of the game, 2 players could very likely have 2 entirely different teams of 6. And you can play the same game a second time with a different party and give yourself a different experience as well. Something that the early Pokemon games do especially well compared to the newer entries is getting the game going right away. Unlike the modern games, which usually have a mandatory tutorial that takes 1 or more hours, Gen 1 has a mercifully short tutorial that is over in minutes. Having an extremely long tutorial or a never-ending compilation of unskippable dialogue-heavy cutscenes has the potential to absolutely kill any replayability a Pokemon game would hope to have, nullifying one of the best aspects of the Pokemon series formula.
Thank God it don't got that in it.
The strength of this aspect of Pokemon is especially apparent in Nuzlocke challenges, which limit the selection of Pokemon available to you in a single playthrough, encouraging or even requiring you to use Pokemon that you might not have used otherwise, and making for drastically different experiences across different runs of the same game. Chapter 2 – Classic Pokemon. Finally, the 3rd generation of Pokemon is where I personally think the series became legitimately great for the first time. Abilities were introduced to the series, and in combination with hold items and the type system, the battle system hit critical mass. These 3 systems combined gave Pokemon highly specialized niches where they could find use even if they were outclassed in stats. New strategies were made available, such as weather teams, with abilities like Swift Swim and Chlorophyll. Other noteworthy additions in this generation were the revamped EV and IV system, the hold item Macho Brace, which made EV training easier, EV reducing berries, eggs inheriting 3 IVs from parents, animated sprites for opposing Pokemon, although once again this was only available in the 3rd version, Emerald, and finally the Emerald Battle Frontier. As with every generation, additions were made to the monsters, hold items, and moves. But I think that this generation made some especially interesting additions, such as the creative moves like Endeavor, Helping Hand, Yawn, and Wish, as well as the item Choice Band. Something to note with this generation is that it was not possible to transfer Pokemon from the previous games to this one. This was a result of hardware changes between generations, as the link cables used to connect one Pokemon cartridge to another would not allow a GBA game to connect to a GB or GBC cartridge. Despite this, all Pokemon were present in the data of the Gen 3 games at launch, and would later be possible to legitimately obtain by linking and trading with FireRed and LeafGreen, as well as the GameCube games Colosseum and XD. Speaking of Colosseum and XD, these games were something to behold, or at least XD is. Pokemon Colosseum was the first real 3D Pokemon adventure, and it and XD were developed by Genius Sonority. The models and animations of Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon were copied from Pokemon Stadium, and the Gen 3 Pokemon received completely original models and animations. Unlike the Stadium games, however, Colosseum and XD feature campaigns similar to those of the main series. Like the Stadium games, the animations in Colosseum and XD are very beloved for displaying a lot of personality for each Pokemon. As many of you are likely aware, Colosseum was very different from every Pokemon game which came before, and to this day is still one of the most unique Pokemon games that uses the turn-based battle system. There's no tall grass in this game. Instead, there are 48 Shadow Pokemon in the campaign that are available for you to catch. As was previously mentioned, these Pokemon could be transferred to a Gen 3 game to fill in the otherwise unobtainable selections of the Pokédex. As a result, most of these Pokemon are from Gen 2, which has the perhaps unintended effect of making the games much more difficult, as Gen 2 Pokemon are infamously weak. In addition to these changes to catching Pokemon, all battling is done in double battles, a combination of this limited, gimped roster, double battle format, as well as a huge spike in enemy levels at the end of the game, has deservedly earned this game the status of the most difficult Pokemon game. Unfortunately, the difficulty can often feel unfair, such as the previously mentioned spike in opponent levels, and a scarcity of healing points, requiring you to make long treks backwards to heal your Pokemon between battles. Despite these problems, as well as the strangely ugly NPC models present in the game, this unique take on Pokemon showed a lot of promise, and it would eventually be realized in Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. This sequel makes the games much more fair, adds a lot of additional Pokemon to catch and use, adds more quality of life features such as healing points and the ability to purify more than one Pokemon at a time, much better looking models for characters, and incredible side content, being Bingo Battle and Battle CDs. The Battle CDs are especially something that I cannot believe has been omitted in every mainline Pokemon game since. They're short puzzles that take place in a battle with predetermined Pokemon for you and your opponent. It's like if a Pokemon battle were an escape room. For example, one of the puzzles has you attack your own Porygon, so that when you use Conversion 2, you'll be impervious to the opponent's explosion, and then use Foresight on the opponent's Dusclops, so that they'll take damage from their own ally's explosion. This is such a wonderful idea to teach players mechanics that they wouldn't have otherwise been aware of in a controlled environment. This is seriously the perfect tutorial for a Pokemon game. It can teach players how to deal with specific threats, the value of setup moves, and how to use niche moves and secondary effects without any sort of overbearing dialogue. Battle CDs are like a more interactive version of the Trainer Academy and Stadium 2, with an admittedly much narrower scope. These games seem to really fly under the radar of most Pokemon players, so if you're a fan of the mainline games and haven't played these, I'd highly recommend playing XD at least. Other than Scarlet and Violet, these games are the only Pokemon games to dare to deviate somewhat from the series' established formula, and because of that, XD is one of my favorite games in the series. Releasing 2 years after Ruby and Sapphire was Pokemon Emerald. This was the third version of the generation, following the apparent standard set by Yellow and Crystal. Like its predecessors, it changed up the plot of the game a slight amount, and like Crystal, placed an increased emphasis on a different legendary Pokemon, and featured animated Pokemon sprites. The biggest addition in Emerald was the introduction of the Battle Frontier to the series, which is a collection of 7 battling facilities that each host different game modes available for you to challenge endlessly after beating the game. In Ruby and Sapphire, only the Battle Tower was present, which is only one of the 7 facilities available in Emerald. And the Battle Tower even received an upgrade in Emerald, adding Pokemon that were not native to Hoenn to the tower. The Battle Factory is my favorite facility. It's like a draft tournament where you choose a few Pokemon from a random selection to join your team at the beginning of the challenge, and after each victory, you have the option of trading one of your rental Pokemon for a Pokemon you just defeated. The thing that's so great about this mode is that you can play it forever. It has a lot of strategy in who you choose to join your team, and rewards game knowledge in players who know what moves the opponent Pokemon might have. Another thing that makes it so great is that because you only use rental Pokemon in this mode, there's no EV training, grinding, or breeding you need to do to play it. Not all facilities were winners though, such as the Battle Palace, which is a facility that prevents you from commanding your Pokemon. Instead, your Pokemon will randomly choose their moves, with probabilities of what move is selected being influenced by their nature. This mode is very contrary to the Battle Factory, and to get the best odds of winning, you'll need to breed and train a new team with highly specific natures, and this is before there were any items to change the nature of your Pokemon. And once you have the right team, you just send your Pokemon out and hope for the best. Not very engaging at all, and very prone to frustration. Regardless of one or so battle facilities being disappointing, the Battle Frontier is one of the best additions to any Pokemon game, and it adds endgame content by testing the player's strength and skill through multiple different endless game modes. Intermission 2. Third Versions. The 7 battle facilities were post-game content that you could really sink your teeth into and play endlessly. It was an incredible addition to a third version of a game, and I find that kind of troubling. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that this feature was included in Gen 3, but why bother making multiple versions of a Pokemon game if there exists one definitive best version of the game to play? And for someone who already bought Ruby or Sapphire 2 years prior, if they wanted to play the Battle Frontier, they would need to buy a separate game at full price and replay an almost identical story to reach this new content. Similarly, the animated sprites in Pokemon Crystal are such a nice change that makes the Pokemon much more lively, but it's not a worthwhile reason to buy another game at full price. This exact same dilemma would be present in Generation 4's Platinum, which once again would exclusively feature a Battle Frontier in the third version of the game, and would also be the first game to feature animated back sprites for your own Pokemon. Even more so than releasing 2 versions at once, the third version of a Pokemon game is a business tactic to make more money selling what is essentially the same game to people who already own it. But even more insidious than selling 2 versions of the same game at launch, there's some new content in the third version, which makes passing it up all the more difficult. Starting in Generation 8, we got DLC to replace the third version, which I think is a wonderful change and something that should have been done starting in Sun and Moon. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are actually pretty bad offenders because not only are they bifurcated third versions, but they also have exclusive content such as Pokemon and Z-moves that prevents them from being able to fully communicate with base Sun and Moon, fracturing the ability to battle and trade with other players with one of the Alola games. Hopefully third versions stay dead, because the idea of paying $60 to play a new generation when it comes out, and then another $60 for the enhanced version that you're also required to have to participate in competitive events, would just be outrageous. Also released in 2004, the same year as Emerald, was Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen. These Generation 3 games were remakes of the original Gen 1 games, Red and Blue. Because these are Generation 3 games, they made all 151 of the Generation 1 Pokemon obtainable in the other Generation 3 games via trade, allowing all Pokemon to be legitimately obtained between Ruby Sapphire, Colosseum XD, and FireRed LeafGreen. Along with making the National Pokédex completable, these games were also a massive upgrade to the Kanto games, rendering the region in full-color 16-bit graphics for the first time, adding abilities and hold items to the battle system, as well as updated moves and other miscellaneous mechanical updates. While I think that this iteration of Kanto is far superior to its original rendition, it still suffers from the same pitfalls that hold back the original games. There are still so many more water and poison type Pokemon than any other type. The addition of the Dark and Steel types in Gen 2 to balance out the type chart might as well be absent since there's no Dark types in Kanto and only one Steel type. Wild Pokemon are often an inappropriately low level when you encounter them. The Sylph Rocket hideout still sucks. The tea you need to get into Saffron City can easily be missed. There were plenty of great additions I already mentioned, but there are strange omissions that seem like they should be no-brainers to add in, like making it possible to breed Pokemon at the daycare on Route 4, or evolving Eevee into Umbreon or Espeon, which are things that you just can't be done in these games. Not to mention, other evolutions to Kanto Pokemon added in later gen, such as Crobat, are not obtainable before beating the champion. Why? It's like the developers were afraid of changing things, as almost all trainers in wild Pokemon tables are unchanged down to the exact level you encounter them at. And when they did add something new, being the Sevi Islands, they had to quarantine it to an entirely separate island and make it optional. This hesitance to deviate the region from its original state causes it to end up feeling dated when compared to the contemporary Emerald, and even more so when comparing it to Pokemon games released later. The fourth generation of Pokemon games introduced us to the Sinnoh region, in Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. Also released in Generation 4 was Pokemon Battle Revolution and Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. The biggest change introduced in Generation 4, and also the last change to redefine how Pokemon battling works, was the physical special split. Younger fans may not know that prior to Generation 4, all moves of a given type were always either physical or special. For example, all fire, water, and grass type attacks were special attacks, and all normal fighting and flying attacks were physical attacks. In Generation 4, the system was updated to the way it works today, where individual attacks are defined to be either physical or special. This allows physical and special attackers of the same type to thrive, regardless of their type, at least in theory. Along with this massive change, the new EV system from Gen 3 was built upon, with the introduction of power items. These make EV training take only a fraction of the time it took in Gen 3, even with the Macho Brace. Breeding Pokemon was also made a little bit more accessible, as the power items would also let you guarantee one stat to be passed down from the parents when breeding. Breeding also received another buff, being the Masuda method, which is a method of obtaining shiny Pokemon through eggs. In addition to the game that I think gets really slept on is Ball Seals, which are exclusive to Gen 4. Seals are a feature that make me scratch my head as to why they aren't available in every following game, because they add so much extra personality and flair to a trainer and their Pokemon. And two final additions to this generation were animated back sprites and Pokemon walking with you in the overworld. Sadly, these additions were not available in every Gen 4 game, much like the battle animations present in Emerald and Crystal. Released a couple months after Diamond and Pearl in 2006 was Pokemon Battle Revolution. This game was developed by Genius Sonority, who, as you may recall, made the GameCube Pokemon titles. However, I'm saddened to recount that this game was not a worthy successor to those games. Don't get me wrong, the game isn't bad. It's actually quite fun. You essentially just participate in different battle arenas with unique rules, similar to a Battle Frontier. But there's no overworld, no story, and no catching of Pokemon or Shadow Pokemon. And much more unfortunate is that this is the last of the supplemental console Pokemon games. After this game, Genius Sonority would go on to make games unrelated to Pokemon, as well as a few casual games on the 3DS and a couple mobile games as well. Quick tangent, I remembered this game being really difficult when I played it as a stupid kid in like 2008. So when I replayed Pokemon Platinum 4 years ago, I brought a competitive team with EVs, Natures, and Egg moves to send it to the game, because you're encouraged to transfer your own Pokemon from the mainline DS games to PBR. But as it turned out, the game wasn't actually hard. I was just a stupid kid and was bad at the game. The team I bred ended up being so overpowered in the game that I didn't use any of them and just used the rental Pokemon to play through the game. But yeah, it is quite sad that we haven't gotten a game in the style of Colosseum or XD since the GameCube, or even like the Stadium games or PBR. I would happily buy a Switch Pokemon game that was just focused on battling if it had epic animations for every Pokemon and just added a few quality of life features to make optimizing Pokemon less tedious. Especially if the narrator of the original anime would narrate the battles like in this game. I believe that Diamond and Pearl are already amazing games, but Platinum outshines them in every way, just by a little bit. In addition to the previously mentioned animated back sprites, there are more fun GIF Pokemon that were post-game in the original games. There are more Pokemon added to the regional decks, a new Battle Frontier to replace the lone battle tower in the original games, and lots of miscellaneous changes like increased surf speed and a back button on the Pokétch. Like Emerald, the Battle Frontier in this game can be played endlessly, especially the Battle Factory, which returned with updated Pokemon available to use. I still go back to exclusively play the Platinum Battle Factory every few months just because it's so fun. This is my personal favorite Pokemon game. I love Platinum in this period of the Pokemon franchise so much, I recently cried in my car when the Frontier Brain music from Platinum started playing. Because this game does such a good job of evoking emotion from the player, and I don't know if any Pokemon game will ever be able to do that again. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver are incredibly overrated games. And it makes me sad to say that. They're held back from being possibly the best Pokemon games due to how closely they followed the source material. Despite that, I have massive respect for the effort put into these titles. There were so many additions made to the Johto region in Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. The one everyone remembers most fondly is following Pokemon. This small feature clearly took a lot of work, as every Pokemon has its own walking sprite with a front, back, and sides, as well as an alternate version for every Pokemon's shiny variant. It is quite shocking that this feature was almost entirely absent until Scarlet and Violet, when it so perfectly encourages one of the things Pokemon is supposedly about, creating a bond between the player and their Pokemon. When replaying HeartGold for this video, follower Pokemon were actually my favorite part of the experience. Talking to my Pokemon throughout the story and getting their reactions to the environment and their mood honestly did make me feel more connected to them. Another great addition was Voltorb Flip, which I'm just going to take a minute to discuss here. In the 4 generations leading up to this game, there would be a game corner where players could literally spin slot machines to win coins and prizes in their Pokemon games. These casinos stopped appearing in games because they raised the European age rating of the games, essentially making the games as teen for their minor inclusion of gambling. Rather than doing less and removing the game corner, HeartGold SoulSilver made Voltorb Flip to replace it, which is a minigame similar to Minesweeper. I think this is a great microcosm of the ambition that HeartGold SoulSilver had. After HeartGold SoulSilver, no other games would feature a game corner. Other great features in HeartGold SoulSilver are the Pokathlon, photos of you and your team, extra routes, berry terrariums in your bag, and even the entire Platinum Battle Frontier was included. To backtrack to what I think is holding this game back, well, it's exactly the same things I think hold Gen 2 back. The level of rocket grunts in wild Pokemon are laughably low, making battles feel like a waste of your time at many points. This problem's even worse when you get to Kanto, as levels of wild Pokemon are unchanged from Red and Blue, despite Kanto being a post-game area in this game. Much too often, when you encounter a new Pokemon, it's already too late to use due to how low its level is. In addition to this, all of the Gen 4 evolutions to Pokemon are unobtainable until either the move relearner is accessed at the end of the Johto campaign, or they just aren't obtainable until the post-game, because for some reason, that's where all the evolution stones are. No thank you. I do not think I will keep my Sunkern unevolved all the way through 16 badges just to get Rock Climb and finally get a Sunstone to evolve it. Some of the regular Pokemon are even incredibly hard to get a hold of. Like, why is Yanma only available on one route at 1% encounter rate? Seriously, so many of the Pokemon available in this game might as well not exist because training, evolving, or just obtaining them is so unreasonable. This inability to obtain many of the new Pokemon, along with there only being 4 Gen 2 Pokemon across all 8 of the Johto Gym Leaders teams, leaves the game lacking much of an identity. That isn't even to mention how so many of the Gen 2 Pokemon are undesirable competitively. Ladian, Ariados, Unknown, Corsola, Delibird, these Pokemon didn't even get any evolutions, post-game or otherwise, and are useless compared to the better options available, especially in the context of a regular in-game playthrough. The game actually feels extremely restrictive with its team building, due to the limited availability of Pokemon, combined with the massive level gap between your party and that of the gym leaders. The game either requires several hours of grinding to not get outpaced in levels, catching legendary Pokemon to aid you, or cheese. I ended up cheesing most of the bosses after Claire, with a huge stockpile of healing items and strategies like Choice Scarf Toxic Spikes and Intimidate cycling with revives. I don't know how other people seem to be unbothered by this issue, but I certainly found the level scaling to undermine the entire experience. If you remember my brief talk about Gen 2 earlier in this video, you might be wondering why this section is so much more negative than I was an hour ago. The reason for that is because Gen 2 was a huge improvement on Gen 1, but this game is honestly a step backwards from the other Gen 4 games in terms of gameplay. I don't know why the remakes have been so determined to not broaden the selection of Pokemon available during the campaign, nor change the level of opposing Pokemon. But if it weren't for these hindrances, I think that HeartGold SoulSilver could have been the best Pokemon game we ever got, and it's a shame that these flaws are so damning that they bring down all the great new additions to the game. Pokemon's 5th generation of games was, and still is, unique in that it's the only generation of games to not have any revisions made or gimmicks added to the battle system. Instead, the Unova games took a moment to refine what had been being built up for the previous 4 generations. Every Pokemon sprite is now animated at all times. Every trainer has animated sprites in the battle scene. The largest number of new Pokemon were introduced in a single generation. A narrative involving multiple characters was given a chance to develop for the first time in the series. HMs were made optional. TMs were changed to be infinite use. Unique music was added to each gym. Seasons were implemented to add subtle changes to overworld music, the scenery, and available wild Pokemon. Hidden abilities were added to make more Pokemon viable and add diversity to every Pokemon's existing kit. Shiny Pokemon were finally acknowledged, and the Shiny Charm was introduced. And breeding was iterated upon again to allow the player to guarantee what ability and nature will be passed to the offspring. These are a lot of little changes that just made the Pokemon experience better. The only big shakeup to the campaign in this generation is that Black and White feature exclusively new Pokemon until the post-game. I go back and forth on this, because on one hand, this is really cool and gives the region a very distinct personality. But on the other, many of these designs are extremely derivative. Sock and Throw are clearly the same concept as Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee. Audino is Chansey, Garbodor is Muk, Bouffalant is Tauros, Alomomola is Lovedisk. I don't dislike any of these Pokemon on their own, and I think this concept can be pretty effective, such as the new Mimic Pokemon Fungus, which is a new take on the same role that Voltorb served in Generation 1. But with others, especially Alomomola and Bouffalant, they're just bigger versions of their original counterparts. Because of these copycat Pokemon, the region with no returning Pokemon, ironically, still has a lot of Generation 1 nostalgia bait. As I briefly mentioned, the narrative was actually given focus in this generation. The plot focuses on the evil team, Team Plasma in this case. Where this gets interesting is near the start of the game, when the leader of Team Plasma, Getsus, is preaching that the relationship between trainers and their Pokemon is exploitative. This rhetorical question feels ridiculously out of place for a Pokemon story, asking the player to question their own actions and potentially depicting them as villainous. Along with Getsus, N is the other critical character to the story of Black and White. He can apparently speak with Pokemon, and is vehemently against capturing and battling Pokemon at the start of the game. The setup of these games is intriguing, and it really seems like the games shifted their demographics to a slightly older audience, which is actually exactly what they were trying to do, according to this Nintendo Power interview.
From the very beginning of development, we tried to see the series through the eyes of older players who had graduated from the series. Does it seem too cute? Is the writing off-putting? Is it too childish? We wanted to change these things to make it more appealing to older players. We also wrote a story that we thought would be a little more interesting for an older audience.
The story isn't actually as deep as it leads you to think though, as in the end, the game plainly states that Pokemon training and battling is good actually. But despite this massive cop-out and return to the status quo, fans still herald this narrative as being the best in the series by far, which I honestly think says a lot more about the narrative of other games in the series than it does about this one. This was sadly the first and last time Pokemon would give the narrative a significant focus in a mainline game. Pokemon Black and White 2 are a fan-favorite game, and it's easy to see why. It has a huge roster of Pokemon available to catch compared to all the games that came before it, and it's able to capitalize on the emphasized story of the first game with the return of characters such as N, Getsus, Charon, and Bianca. My favorite inclusion in this game is the PWT, which replaces the Battle Frontier in this generation. The PWT houses dozens of powerful trainers from the previous games, including all gym leaders and champions. And there was even an online event distribution that allowed you to add the real-life World Champion and finalist players from the 2012 Pokemon World Championships into the game as PWT trainers. Even at the expense of the Battle Factory, the PWT was a very worthy inclusion, and it's great seeing Pokemon actually take advantage of its long history with some tasteful nostalgia bait. This game does a really great job with its balancing. While playing, I felt like I was frequently running into challenges that pushed me to change up my strategies, that were also surmountable without grinding. Black and White 2 are probably the best in the whole series in terms of offering fair but challenging obstacles. An innovation of Generation 5's that made this possible is the scaled EXP formula. This new EXP formula gives your Pokemon more XP if it's a lower level than the opponent it knocked out, and less XP if your Pokemon's a higher level. While this must make grinding an even more tedious chore if your strategy is just to overlevel opponents, this formula is great at maintaining a more consistent level of challenge throughout the campaign by boosting weak Pokemon and slowing down overused Pokemon. This also helps make full teams of 6 easier to raise, which can be kind of unrealistic in the older Pokemon titles. Black and White 2 are one of the best entries in the series, boasting one of the best campaigns and post-games, which makes it all the more sad to see that it sold terribly. While Black and White 1 sold a combined 15.6 million copies, Black and White 2 sold a combined total of only 8.2 million copies. This number falls neatly in line with the sales of third versions such as Platinum and Ultra Sun and Moon. But this game is so much more than any of those tertiary versions that have released before or since, featuring an entirely original plot, many original characters, and a whole new expanded Pokédex in addition to the usual third version upgrades. If it weren't for the shared setting, which is even remixed in Black and White 2, it might as well have been an entirely original game. This extra effort put into the game unfortunately garnered seemingly no additional sales. This, in addition to the critical reception of Black and White 1, unfortunately seems to have sent the message to Game Freak that deviating from the established Pokemon formula brings about negative reactions from fans. This would eventually change with the massive shakeups in Pokemon Legends Arceus and Scarlet Violet, but in the 11 years in between then and Black and White 2, they played it very safe. The classic era of Pokemon brought Pokemon to what I, and seemingly the majority of Pokemon fans, consider to be the peak of the series. Abilities were the last piece necessary to make Pokemon of the same type, who may even have similar stat spreads, develop unique identities. And the physical special split in Generation 4 enabled all Pokemon to take full advantage of their type's stab bonus, regardless of if they're physical or special attackers. Generation 5 did not add any crazy new mechanics or battle gimmicks to the series out of respect for the system that they developed across the previous 4 generations, and instead they opted to lay down additional polish to the game overall. Gen 5 even omitted making a third version and instead opted to release sequels that offered a significantly different campaign. The series seemed to be moving its target audience to slightly older players who had played previous Pokemon games, evident by the increased skill cap of the games, absence of in-depth tutorials, and was even stated in an interview with Masuda himself. A focus on competitive battling also started developing in this era. The Battle Tower in Gen 2 was the start of it, but it really got going with the Battle Frontier in Generations 3 and 4. Gen 4 was also when the first Pokemon World Championships happened, in 2008. Despite this new focus on competitive battling, obtaining perfectly viable Pokemon was extremely difficult in this era. Another similarity between the games in this era, and even the first 2 generations, is the holistic environments and subtle details and storytelling that happens in them. In Hoenn, the box art legendaries are represented through the gameplay mechanics of weather, and the player's exploration of both land and Hoenn's large ocean. Lore details about the regions or specific towns makes these games feel more lived in, such as the folktales about Sinnoh's creation and the relationship between the inhabiting humans and Pokemon. In Black and White, N's party is completely composed of species that can be found on the route he's on. Because he doesn't catch the wild Pokemon, he summons them with his ability to communicate with them. This kind of cohesion just isn't found in the newer games, and that's a shame. Hey, first of all, thank you for making it to the end of the video. This is the end of part 1. In the next video, I'll talk about the mechanics of competitive Pokemon as well as acquiring a competitive team, Pokemon fan projects like ROM hacks, and the rest of the Pokemon generations, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And maybe 10, if that's a thing by the time I'm done with the next video. To be honest, it's been hard to find time to work on this video. I am now employed, which I was not when I started this project, and video editing is very frustrating for me. I would really appreciate it if you could like, comment, subscribe, and share this video. Seeing number go up is a big motivator for me, so maybe that'll help me finish part 2 sooner. Part 2 of this video is already in the works, so make sure you subscribe so you'll be notified when it's done. And in case it wasn't clear during the video, I just want to restate that I do love Pokemon. It's a bit of a love-hate relationship sometimes, but for better and for worse, I do really care about this franchise. I have very nostalgic memories playing Gen 4 as a little kid, and I have really precious memories playing it with my friend in Gen 6. That's all for now though. Stay safe and have a nice day.